I'm often left equally, I guess, depressed by Greg's talks as I am inspired, because I think there is a general sense here that we're talking about a lot of things that are very difficult to overcome. There's a lot of barriers. And I tried to take down a few notes, both as Greg and Sam were talking, to reflect on some of their points, and I think I'll draw on those now. The first was, so your very first slide was around the Google image reflection on CSR, and my immediate response was, please nobody go and Google image EY. It's hugely in the Fin review already. You'll get some rather disturbing pictures. But it's that general sense, though, when you do that of, hands holding leaves, small little frogs jumping from trees. I think I mentioned to somebody in this room only yesterday, if I see a sustainability report with a windmill, children running through a hay field, I'm going to kill myself. We have this sense that there's a propulsion in business that this is a separate entity. Sam touched on it. It's an individual within a company often. Some of you are here today who are bastions of sustainability as though it's a separate enterprise from the development and the sustainable development of that company more generally. And I think that's clearly, to me anyway, what I see as the direct challenge over the next coming years, whether we call that a decade or longer. I think it was Milne who said that business is entirely separate from society and shouldn't concern itself with it. I think we now all recognise that that's entirely wrong, and that society is inextricably, as Greg clearly put that, linked to society's wider gain. And yet we do have this sense that there is a challenge. I mean, we talked about the tall poppy syndrome. That there aren't fearless leaders willing to stand up and stand out and give their own views. And it's kind of interesting because I stopped myself when I got up here today from saying I'm speaking on behalf of myself tonight and not Ernst & Young, because that's the classic response to what we're supposed to do, and legally that's what I'm supposed to tell you, so that's what I am doing tonight. But yeah, absolutely. But genuinely, I think it's a very fair point. It's that brave leadership. And it's those people who are willing to not sacrifice the short-term gains in business, but to recognise that those short-term gains are at the expense of the long-term value creation of any organisation. I've been involved recently with the IIRC, the International Integrated Reporting Council, which has been fascinating in many respects, mainly because I've engaged more widely globally with practitioners like yourselves in this room who work around the world. And we had, I guess, the privilege of working on the notion of how organisations start to talk about value creation. And I put somewhat of a different view to Greg's on the table, which is that we should be monetising all of those non-financial aspects. We should put a monetised value on environmental and social aspects that impact the long-term value of a company. Now, I can tell you here, I was shot to death. Principally from within the IRC, where they recognise that sort of view is so fundamentally juxtaposed with where businesses are at today that they'll no longer be able to move on their journey towards what they ultimately see as a necessity for organisations to start to talk about their true value and how they're recognised. Of course, I counter-challenged that by saying, well, this is a nonsense, of course, because EY and other companies that carry out valuations on companies already do this. When we are asked to value a company if somebody's going to buy another organisation, we don't simply go and look at the share price and say, well, work it out for yourself. We actually calculate what the value of a brand is, what the risk of the environmental factors in the long term are, what the stock of the resources that company owns, whether that's renewable or finite. So I don't necessarily see that's a huge challenge to us in the long run. Greg also and Sam also touched on this concept of a sphere of influence, and how companies think about their local agenda, whether that's their own people, their local networks, regional, national, or internationally. I would actually say that now all businesses are global businesses. I would challenge you to give me an example of a business which isn't in some way linked to the global economy. And so those spheres of influence necessarily require companies to think outside of their own box and to have an understanding of their own supply chains forward and back, so their value chain more holistically. And I don't get a sense that all companies even understand their own value chains yet, let alone have an influence over them. It's getting more depressing. This isn't. I'll move it. I'll move it upbeat. What is quite interesting, though, is that we touched on a few different points in relation to the indices that you talked about and others, Greg, where we start to get to this concept again of how do we recognise growth more holistically, and it's not just a concept of GDP. I think we need to move beyond that. But again, the tall poppy syndrome. If we look overseas and we look at, say, the Sustainable Development Commission in the UK, they produced a report, I'm going to get the name wrong, Prosperity Without Growth, Beyond Growth, which effectively said that despite the global financial crisis in the UK and other pressures that they faced during the period, there were a number of indicators that would show that the economy has grown. Social inclusion had improved, the environment, but due to some of the economic factors, meaning that greenhouse gas emissions and other environmental factors had reduced. There was general growth in the economy at a wider state. Now, whether directly or indirectly, Treasury took a reasonably poor response to that report, and the Commission got closed down. And that's kind of me. It's a reflection in a government agency sense of that tall poppy syndrome. Somebody who is willing to step beyond the boundary of how we currently view national economies, to start to think about their growth in the long term. But I think we need to come back to some of those concepts, because fundamentally, I mean, some of the slides we saw here today, if we only look at the first megatrend being people alone, we need to start to try and review some of those in more detail. What I did find interesting here as well was a discussion around perhaps the immediacy of concerns around issues. So, our Australians and what we felt was important. Firstly, I find that part hugely depressing, that in the top 3 box there we think that the people coming via boat is our biggest concern in this country. But more generally, it then leads us to this, what's driving these sort of discussions? And we talked about tweets and social media. I'm not a tweeter. I keep getting told off for not being a tweeter. But it's very clear, though. I mean, we now in our business are starting to do more work around social media and mining that sort of data to understand what the materiality is for an organisation around certainly the non-financial drivers in their business. And organisations, just like governments and politicians, are being driven by what the people at large think. And again, rightly or wrongly. I mean, just because the consensus of view in a country is that something is important doesn't necessarily mean that there is an evidence base to support that is important in reality. And I think, again, some of those things will need to play out into the long term. I was also reminded by Sam in relation to the role of boards or individuals on boards having that provocation role. Principally here, probably I've seen more so around gender than any other driver. But only a day ago in the US we had a 50-year reunion of Martin Luther King's talk, and what was interesting to me was that President Obama, who was, I think, a clear person that was going to talk about that given his own race and the role that he had, used that as a platform to talk about same-sex marriage inequality and climate change. Again, taking that very long-term view and making that a relation point that people can understand in terms of something that prior to King's speech and the preceding years would have been something that would have seemed to be impossible. So I think that's a positive, certainly. And again, we heard Sam when we saw Sam show us some of those reports. We did some work here in New South Wales looking at, we were asked to find 100 opportunities in the New South Wales economy under a low carbon or a challenged economy in terms of some of those environmental factors. And we looked at it quite fundamentally from an economic perspective. So we drove it with the best data we had from an environmental perspective, and we had 100 opportunities. We had more, we had to cap them down to make it 100, it's a better number. We had a change in government in New South Wales, and it was a soft release of that, because somehow the word sustainability, the words climate change weren't politically robust, even though the analysis itself had nothing to do with a political sphere. So I do think we do need to overcome some of those significant barriers. I guess the last thing, if I can just reflect on a few points and my own views. we seem to have a little bit of a disconnect here, and we talked somewhat around organizations thinking about strategy, management, boards considering strategy, where they look into the short, mid or long term, however you measure those and however you think about them. And then we also talked about reporting, so informing people, either on a daily basis or on your prior year's basis, how you've actually achieved. And there's a clear disconnect there between what companies do to think about how they move into the future and how they actually tell you what they've done over the last few days, few weeks, months, quarters, or even the last year. And so the question to me then is, how are either individuals, be that the CEO or board members, members of management themselves, how do those companies, the sectors or countries how are they managed in terms of their success? So we come back to these concepts of how do you ensure that organizations are really looking at long-term value growth, and how do you reward individuals in whatever way you seek to reward people for building up an organization and engendering a spirit within businesses that will enable the true sense of the word, sustainable growth of those businesses over time. And at the moment, my sense is, unless we do break down that disconnect between strategy and reporting, which I will admit is a huge challenge for organizations like ours, if you all start talking about forward-facing information in your annual reports, as a financial audit firm, we struggle with that. That's a difficulty. It raises huge, complex challenges for us. It questions what legal rights we have to sign off on things. You as board members, me as an audit partner. But I do think we need to start to ask those questions and challenge ourselves, and maybe challenge the legal system, or challenge something that's prohibiting us from undergoing those sorts of conversations. That means we might move from the now, where clearly we understand there are difficulties in moving forward, to the future we need to achieve. Beyond that, I'd just like to thank Greg and Sam as well for giving us some incredible thoughts, and hopefully I've reflected on them well. But before I do close off today, I would like to also mention Chris, and the reason I'd like to do that is because we touched on the sense of us as practitioners. So many of you in the room who I do know, and many of you I know of, are practitioners and seen as these sustainability practitioners. I put those in inverted commas. And there is this kind of sense that we have this role within companies to be the social conscience, to be the individual, the gatekeeper, the auditor within the organisation to drive things forward, or the person at the end of the day where you have a drive towards an economic growth story. And can this person look after the environment or the social aspects? Some of Chris's research, and I can say this because I reread it the other day, some of Chris's research looks at these people in this room and outside, and their views on how they feel personally they're driven. It's very fascinating. I wouldn't mind Chris even taking a couple of moments to talk about it, because what I took away from that was actually within ourselves, we have probably a three-way chimera. You have a responsibility to the company to make sure that you're doing the right thing and not saying the wrong thing. So you end up saying things like, we'll put this into economic terms. So this energy efficiency makes good sense because we're going to save money, not necessarily because there are non-financial benefits that are going to mean it's good for our business as a whole. There's the greenies and the pinkies part of each of us, which is trying to drive forward that agenda and feel good about ourselves, and go to sleep at night saying I've done the right thing. But there's also that third part, which is around trying to move from what we talked about earlier, which is the individual having that role, which I think is now detrimental, and moving that into embedding it within organizations, so that there's an integrated thinking in how we work, as opposed to an individual thinking around these concepts of sustainability. So I don't know, Chris, I'm going to screw up your day, but I don't know if you have 2 minutes to talk about that research, because I think it's fundamentally important and very interesting in terms of where we are. But thank you.